Thanks, Sheena. Afternoon, everyone. So I'm Rafe Ball, and I'm the Learning Innovation Manager at Colt Technology Services. We're a provider of integrated network, data, voice, and IT solutions to customers across Europe, US, and Asia. Been at Colt for about 4 years, and before that, I worked for IT research company Gartner for about 10 years, where I worked a number of roles in L&D and as Director of Knowledge Support. So in all those roles, I've worked very closely with learning data. I've tried a few different approaches, made a few mistakes, learned a few lessons. And what I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes or so is share a few best practices from my experience with you that I hope will help you in putting your learning data to work. So here are the high-level things that I'm going to cover off, and I'd be happy to drill down into more detail on any of these in the Q&A. So to start off with, are we asking the right questions to get the data that we need? Talk about moving beyond the traditional happy sheets to measure more deep levels such as behavioural change and business impact. How to make your data reliable, coherent and understandable so we can communicate it well and it'll be trusted by the business. And finally, to wrap up by talking a little bit about the challenge of L D Roi and perhaps why you might not always need it anyway. So to start off with, are we asking the right questions? So you can see on the screen here, on the left, you've got the top 5 L&D metrics that L&D commonly reports to the business. So I can see some nodding heads, you probably recognise those. You guys probably report on most, if not all of these already. And on the right are the top 3 questions that the business tends to have for L&D. There's a bit of a mismatch there. On the left, you can see reporting mainly on things like volume and costs, whereas the questions that the business is actually looking for answers for is what are the results we're seeing from L&D, what's the value we're getting from it, and how's it being applied, and how can we increase application so we can get better leverage on our investment in L&D. So for the next few slides, hopefully you'll find some interesting things there for how we might start to answer some of those questions. Okay, so start off with happy sheet. So we're talking about those traditional feedback forms post-event we give out to our attendees, which are pretty much the first stop on all of our journeys in terms of L&D metrics. And they've got a bit of a bad rep. I mean, you can hear the inverted commas when people say happy sheets. But I think they do have their uses. So primarily here we're asking questions around the level 1 Kirkpatrick, so stuff around reaction and satisfaction with the training. So questions like, how would you rate an instructor? How was the classroom environment and so on, with maybe a little bit of level 2 learning effectiveness in there. Did you learn new skills and knowledge on this training? How confident do you feel to do task X after having gone through this? So they don't really help us answer those first 3 questions we looked at. You might have enjoyed the training, you might have absorbed some new knowledge, but are you going to be able to apply that back in the business? What impact is that going to have on the business and what benefits is it going to bring? So that's not to say we shouldn't track these. I think it is important. The delivery is the foundation of it. If we get something wrong on the delivery, that's going to then hamper the learning effectiveness, that's going to affect the behaviour change and how much business impact it has. But it's important we act on stuff here promptly. So I'd recommend having some kind of alert or alarm system set up so that if you do get some low results coming in, you can act on it promptly. If you've got some kind of automated online system, if you can set it up to flag up when there's a low rating coming back, that's great. If you're relying on trainers or managers to do that, so they keep their eyes open for those coming in promptly. If you've got 2 months worth of courses arranged at a particular venue, you don't want to find out in a quarterly review after they've all taken place that the venue wasn't really suitable. You want to address that as soon as you can to either fix that with the venue or maybe go somewhere else. But as I said, they don't really help us address those 3 questions that the business want answered. We need to move a bit deeper. So the first thing there is in terms of measuring behavioural change. And again, our first stop there can be the learner. We don't need to limit ourselves on those post-event feedback sheets to just level 1 and 2 questions. We can ask the learner questions to help us predict what their behaviour change might be like. So we can ask them things like, how relevant was that learning to your job? How much of that learning do you think you're going to be able to apply back on your role? Do you see any obstacles to you doing that? There's some issues with that though. We're basically working off their own assumptions, though they're assumptions based on their own experience, and asking them to predict what's going to happen. And we might come across some self-evaluation bias as well. So generally people tend to overrate their own abilities to a certain degree, so they might think they're going to apply more than they actually do. So it's important that we verify this as well. So what we do at Colt is we go back about 60 days later and we ask them again, now you've had some time to put this into practice, how much actually was relevant? How much have you actually applied? What obstacles actually came up that have hindered your application of this? We also look for external verification, so we can ask managers, and we go out to managers at the same time, that 60-day remove, and ask them, well, what behaviour change have you seen from the guys who went on this course? You could go to customers, you could go to peers to ask similar questions, you could use 360, you could even look at doing things like on-the-job assessment or job observation. You might not want to go into that kind of detail with every single training. If you've got a 30-minute webinar, are you really going to want to go back out to managers and learners 60 days later and start doing on-the-job observation? Probably not. You're probably going to stick at that predictive level. But we can use this data to help answer that question about learning application, particularly in terms of addressing obstacles that might arise. So common things we've come across when we've been looking at this are areas like not having enough time or resources to apply the learning maybe being too theoretical, so they're having trouble with practical application, and particularly a lack of manager support back on the business. And we've used that data to improve our development processes, so we now build in post-learning support tools that can be used back on the business. We introduced pre- and post-course discussion templates for managers to use with their team members so they can establish goals going on to learning and coming off of it. What are we going to do with that knowledge? What have you learned? How can we give you some space and opportunity to apply that? So, presuming we've got some behaviour change going on, we then need to figure out, okay, so what does that actually mean to the business? What are the benefits we're getting out here? And this really starts back way before the training with our training needs analysis. So really establishing, what's the success criteria for this training? What's the issue that we're expecting it to address? And what we're expecting the outcomes to be. So if we're delivering something like a customer service training, okay, maybe we'd expect to see some improvement in customer satisfaction rates and customer retention. We can then target those, look at the relevant statistics, and see how that changes post-training. I'd also recommend identifying standard impact categories. So these might be things like improved productivity, increased sales, reduced costs, and so on, that you can then ask across all training, because this can help you identify other benefit areas that you might not have initially have targeted, but are still benefits to the business. So for example, with that customer service training, you may see there's actually some employee engagement gains as well, because the client services guys feel they're more valued, they're feeling more confident in their abilities, less stressed handling difficult customers, so we get a raise there as well. So it can help compare across courses. And for this, we can ask the same sort of sources that we did in the behaviour questions. We can ask in the post-event questions, which areas, for example, do you see being significantly impacted by this training? We can ask managers again, at a remove, what business benefits have you seen in your team? Have you seen a reduction in costs? Have you seen an improvement in productivity? But there's more measurement here, so we really need to go back into those statistics that we targeted back at the start to say, okay, we've seen this much increase in this area, this much decrease in that area. And again, we can use that to help start demonstrating what results are being impacted and what benefits the business is seeing to address those questions we looked at the beginning. Important thing when we're presenting this data back is making sure we're presenting it in a way that people think, yes, this is reliable data, this looks good, we can trust this data that's being presented to us. And the first step there, it might sound obvious, but is agreeing how to measure, particularly if you're in a distributed L&D environment. You may have different L&D people reporting to different business units, using different forms, different questions, different marking scales that will make comparison very difficult. So it is important to try and agree a common standard. Similarly, try and keep your questions consistent. You may need to change the questions you're asking over time. It's fine to add some questions to help target those expectations, but obviously if you change something in your core question set, make sure it is needed because it will make your historical data comparison difficult. Look for supporting data to reinforce what you're saying. So as we said there, if something's coming back and saying this training has improved employee engagement, look at the employee engagement scores that come back off the next survey for that group if you can, to see if you can back that up. Consider other causes of change that might be affecting those stats. So if your sales program, training program you roll out, after that you see an increase of sales of 10%, is that down to your training program? Or is it down to the fact that you changed the sales management team 6 months ago? Or is it down to a general improvement in the economy? So it's best to ask those questions and address them up front yourself, because if you don't, almost certainly someone in the business will. It's very handy if you can seek out benchmarking comparisons. So one thing you can help with that cause of change, if you've got a control group, so if there's another group that hasn't gone through that training, you can compare that. If you can get external benchmarking data, that can be very valuable. At Colt, we use Metrics That Matter from the Corporate Executive Board. They've got very strong industry benchmarking data available that lets us see, we want to be best in class. What's the rest of the class looking like? If you don't have access to something like that, maybe you have peers in other companies that you can agree to share some data with so you can see how they're doing. If nothing else, you can start building up historical data so that you can compare how you're doing quarter on quarter or year on year. And make sure you provide simple and relevant reporting for your audience. You can end up generating an awful lot of information when you start looking at learning analytics. And that's very useful for us in L&D, but if we try and present that all out to the business or the employee populace in general, they may well find themselves drowning in data, not understanding it. So make sure that what you're presenting is relevant to the audience and it's a form that's going to be readily understandable by them. Okay, the final point I wanted to touch on was about the challenge of ROI in L&D. It's a complex topic. I'm not going to go into detail on it in the remaining minutes. But to really drill in to get true effective ROI, you need an awful lot of data. You need to be figuring out what your true costs of the training are. You need to find out things like what the average salary of the folks on that training were to look at how much productivity increase might equate to a certain amount of dollars. And it's very hard for some of the intangible benefits we see come back from L&D to equate those to a monetary amount. How much money is a 1% increase in client satisfaction worth? Some of your companies might have figured that out and come to an agreement on what that looks like. Probably most of us aren't that fortunate. It can be very useful where we can generate it. If someone's put $500,000 into a particular training program, they're probably going to want to know what they've got back out for that. But what I would say is look at the wider value on investment picture. So value on investment's a concept that Gartner originated. And it basically says don't just look at the financial benefits, look at the benefits in a more holistic manner. So look at those less tangible things like employee engagement, customer satisfaction, increased cycle time, better regulatory compliance, and call those out as well. One of the reasons we introduced MTM at Colt was that we thought our executive board any minute now was going to turn around to us and start telling us how much money have we made off of that training. And 3 years later, they haven't turned around and asked us that question. What they have asked is that question about, well, what's the value? So they're asking for a wider picture. Can I have a quick show of hands? I'd like to check how many people here have actually been asked, what's the monetary ROI on the training you've rolled out? A few, yeah. So it's about, when I've asked this before, it tends to be about 10–15%. So I'm not sure if the other 85% of us are just very lucky or if it's people are looking hopefully at that wider value or investment picture. And again, make sure you account for other factors when you're presenting that data up. So if you present up our training is responsible for this much increase in sales, you're going to be challenged on that almost certainly. It's okay, how did you come up with that number? And if there's been a 5% increase in the general sales across the board because of the economic situation, that's going to be picked up. So to wrap up, ask the right questions to identify business impact, learning value and application. Move beyond the happy sheets, but don't ignore them. They are important. Make your data coherent, integrated and reliable, and communicate it effectively. Include return on investment where it's applicable, but focus on the wider value on investment picture so you can show what the true value of L&D is to the business. Thank you very much.
Wow, a lot to think about there. So now it's your opportunity to ask both Philip and Rafe some questions and get the benefit of their expertise. So what I'm going to do is to ask for a show of hands. We actually normally have somebody with a microphone. Is she just outside the back? Otherwise, you're going to have to speak up. So does anybody like to kick us off? The lady was very quick off the mark there. Would you like to go ahead?
How long did it take you to go from concept to implementation?
4 months.
4 months, okay. So we need to talk. Are you around after this?
Yeah, no worries.
And then a quick question, if I don't mind for that. So you're saying you go back after 60 days, like and speak to leaders or individuals to find out if you feel that you know now, is it still a benefit? Which methodology did you use? Is it face-to-face, email, survey monkey, and more importantly, what's the response rate?
Sure, absolutely. At Colt, we're currently using Metrics That Matter from the Corporate Executive Board, so it's an online solution. So they're automatically emailed and say, it's been 60 days since you did this, please take 5 minutes to fill this in. Response rates, at the moment we're running our post-event survey response rate for last year, top of my head was around 45%. 60 days we tend to see it dropping to around a 25% response, and we're putting in place some measures to try and drive that up this year. I can talk a little bit about that if people are interested.
Super, thank you. Anybody else? Let's have another one. Oh, you're quick on the draw there. Would you like to go ahead?
It's following on from that last question, actually, to Ray, because I was going to ask a similar thing. We put a four-level evaluation in place for a leadership program we've got globally, and we've tried to automate it as much as possible and keep the questions really short to encourage people to do it, but we're still struggling with getting both managers and attendees to complete that evaluation. So what sort of ideas have you got to increase the engagement,
Sure.
apart from giving them a free company toy?
Absolutely. The managers in particular, I think, are really tough nut to crack.
Yeah.
One of the changes we've made over the last year is we've changed it from emailing the managers for each individual attendee, and we now give them a roll-up survey. So if they've had 5 people attend, what the system was previously doing is send them 5 surveys, and of course they're going, I'm not doing that 5 times. So now we send them the one to answer for the team as a whole. They do have the option in there that if there is a particular outlier, they can choose to answer on that person separately. What's really helped though is we've changed our methodology a little bit. So we have a sort of introducing a post-course, not post-course, at the end of the course slide, which again says, here's why we're asking you. So really help people understand this is why we're asking you to do this. It does make a difference. I think a lot of people think, you ask this stuff and it just floats off into the ether, nothing gets done with it. So I think one of the strongest things you can do is actually go back to them and say, okay, based on what you've told us, here are the changes you've made. So how you report that could be, if you've got an L&D site, maybe the quarterly, say, okay, over the last quarter, here are the changes we've made based on what you've told us. And if they see it and go, wow, you guys are actually listening, you're making the improvements, then it sort of becomes a self-replicating thing. You're listening, I'll tell you again next time.
Super. Oh, there she is. Go ahead.
We bought everything off the shelf. We didn't create anything in terms of R&D. We just literally went out to the market, spoke to the right people and got them to put it in. We didn't capital purchase anything either, because that's obviously sometimes a bit of a taboo word, certainly within my organisation. So we just lease all the equipment, which means that year on year we've always got the latest kit.
Interesting. There we go. Would you like to go ahead?
Question for Russ. So in terms of length of time to the impact, what's kind of the longest you've done to kind of assess very broad different impact?
Sure. So we go with a 60-day for the standard survey, but for big programs, we sometimes go a little extra step. So, for example, with our leadership development program, we'd had that running for a few years, and we actually went into an in-depth study with the past attendees. So some of them would have been on in the last 6 months, some would have been on a year ago, maybe even 2 years, and we actually interviewed a group of those. We did a sort of custom survey to them first to get some general feedback on. Now it's been a good amount of time. What have you seen? So reinforcing that methodology. But we actually also set up some face-to-face interviews to get some more qualitative data in. Because as good as the stats are, when you're doing that kind of deep analysis, I think you do need to get that qualitative data to really get down to, okay, exactly what is the benefit here? How do you see this being improved? Yeah. Again, probably only want to do that with very high-value programs. It is very time-intensive.
Anybody got any further questions for our expert panel? They are here for you to delve into their brains. Over to you.
I've got a question for Philip. So the virtual academy, I guess the target audience is technicians and salesmen.
Everybody. Yeah.
How do you deal with the time? Do the technicians have time as a dealer?
Yes.
So they can do it in the workplace?
Yeah, they can do it in the workplace. I think quite interestingly, what we've worked out, we've looked at when people are engaging within training on the LMS. And people are starting to engage in the morning before we even get into the office and at night time when we've left. So a lot of the trainers now are looking for flexible working. So we're actually running virtual sessions past 5 o'clock at night time, and we're even looking at doing it over the weekend when our dealer network's open. So the flexibility of the TV, the apps and the broadcast, which can be pre-recorded, but the face-to-face training, which is via the virtual classroom now, is being run into different times at night time and over the weekend.
But then you could do it outside of work.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Is that choice then?
They have the choice to do it in work time as well, but what we're saying is that a lot of the e-learning modules now that we build and a lot of the apps, people aren't doing it in work time, they're doing it at night time. So what we're trying to do is give them that kind of face-to-face training element in their time at night time, as opposed to when we're there. We're there at 8:30 in the morning, we finish at 4:45 and go home. We finish at 3:30 on a Friday. Our dealers are open till 7, 7:30 at night time and over the weekend. So we're manipulating that now to be a 24/7 training entity virtually.
There we go. Right, hang on. Lady there we go.
Your experience is development of virtual academy. What would you advise others to do it in the best way? Would you seek
I think
cooperation or
actually I probably didn't seek cooperation to start. If you look at my previous slide, nobody was really coming on training, to be completely honest. So we downed tools and completely rebuilt the syllabus. The attended syllabus, but with the virtual in mind, because it's kind of quite a big pill to swallow when you go across the road and speak to the board members and say, guess what, this is what we're going to do. So I built it first, then I delivered it, and then I went and told them, look what we've done. It doesn't work for everybody. And I might not be here today if it hadn't worked.
and did you have some consultancy or some extra?
No, not really. I think we looked at where the issues were, our problems, and it was the only way that we could tackle it. So we knew, using technology, which is what our company's based on, I just went out and looked at the old internet, saw what we could build, put it all together in this mix, and then said, right, everybody, this is what we're going to do. And thankfully, they all worked for me, so therefore, they're going to follow what I asked them to do. And that's what they did. So the success in that is by taking everybody in the direction that you need to go in, and actually give them the training that they need to get their head around the technology, which is what we did. All of my trainers were qualified by the BBC Academy for delivering in front of the camera over the same 4-month period. So while we were building the syllabus, they were also being trained, and they actually got a qualification at the end of it. So that's the trainers dealt with, because they're very apprehensive about delivering in this solution. And then from a business perspective, the return on investment is absolutely huge from a cost perspective. Our budgets have shrank massively, but we're doing more training now than we've ever done. And the engagement with the network is huge, which is great.
Super. Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned the engagement is huge. Do you think how much incentivize?
No, I think that the fact that they can get training now when they want it, a big thing that I mention is that anybody that leaves the dealer site, unfortunately within my business, is on a basic salary. So the minute they leave to come on a 2, 3, 4-day training course, they're on a basic salary. So they're not earning any bonus, or they're not selling a vehicle. Now our business is to sell cars, sell service parts, etc., etc. And the amount of times I see delegates in the stairwell speaking to a customer on the phone because they've come in saying, where's Clive? I want to buy this car. It's a big problem for us, because if we're not selling cars, there's no point in having a budget for a training facility. So this is absolutely perfect. And we actually promote that if you want a training course and somebody comes in, you leave your training course and you go and sell. And then you come back later, because we run 4 sessions a day. I didn't really go into a lot of detail, but we run a virtual session at 9, 11, 1 and 3 every day through every single course that we build. So actually what that's allowed the dealer to do from a management perspective now is culturally is go, I know there's going to be a training course at 9, 11, 1 and 3, and they can book on it 5 minutes before it starts. You can't do an attended course like that. So again, flexibility is there.
Interesting. Yes, go ahead.
You obviously did a great job in terms of reducing costs and facilitating access to learning, let's say, some tool. How do you measure the impact or the success of this super self-learning approach? Because it's super cool and easy to have all these resources accessible everywhere, anytime. But how do you measure that it's actually efficient?
So I suppose from our perspective, we measure it in lots of different ways. I measure the fact that the business now wants to come to the academy as the first point of call when it's got a business problem. The 3% increase on the Motability was worth £6.3 million to the network because of the training. And a proportion of that money would have come back to the brand. because we own a lot of retail group sites. So we now are the first point of call if the business has a problem, rather than far down that table. They come to us straight away. We build a training program in a couple of weeks, we deliver it and we show the results. And ultimately it's all about the money, I'm afraid. But the people are getting something out of it as well, clearly, because they're improving their own performance.
Yeah, so it's a lot about productivity.
Absolutely, they improve their performance, we make more money. That's exactly that's how we measure our ROI.
Tracking. I'll go to the lady at the back. I'll come back to you. So, lady at the back.
Phil. To be fair, that we're moving very quickly to get into serious gaming next. So we're going to. We've already storyboarded the virtual dealership. So we have a franchise network. We have a franchise department. So we are working with the franchise department on the serious game. So essentially, you'll be able to, as a dealer principal who's the business owner, a bit like Sims or a bit like Nintendo Wii. It'll be that type of look. You can decide that your franchise agreement is to have a 30,000 square foot dealership. Well, you'll be able to dial into the game a 30,000 square foot dealership, and you'll be able to employ people and give them tasks through the game. We'll also be able to launch new vehicles in the game. So a car will appear in the showroom, and you'll be able to dial in all of those car assets that you saw in the film. You'll also be summoned to the boardroom where you'll have a virtual classroom session. So we're going to use the game through the LMS, because that's the most important thing here. We have to bring everything through the LMS for metrics and reporting, but the game will be the bit that will be the main interface. Yes, big time, yeah.
Okay. I'll come back to you. The gentleman had a question at the back.
Thanks. I mean, anybody that's involved in the pressurised business is sales.
Thank you.
To be honest. I think it appears to me that you're talking about return of investment and finance money. What about the person? What
Yeah.
I'm thinking about is you sort of suggested they're not a 10 trading, but they're doing it after their working hours or weekends. How have you measured the metrics and the value to the individual and how they feel about that?
I think the great thing is now is that actually we can start getting into that because we've got real value in training. You know, we've been doing this now for 2 years. We had to put the hardware in the infrastructure. Although we put the resources in 4 months, we actually had to build something now where we can start thinking the person is the most important person. I've always thought that, but to get there, you have to really shake up the business. And that's exactly what the Virtual Academy has allowed me to do. So now I get invited to board meetings to talk to them about what we're going to do next. And we're slowly moving away from technology and backing it into the person. But you have to start somewhere to be able to get that level of buy-in.
Smashing. Do you want to go ahead?
Looking probably to both the previous questions, how do you tailor or accommodate the gaming or virtual classroom to different age groups? I work in a company where I'm majoring in graphic.
Yeah.
Trying to introduce technology, social media, virtual learning is a bit of a challenge compared to those who come to the graduate scheme used to press buttons on
I think the interesting thing that I've found, because we have a similar issue in terms of we've got much older technicians that are very good on spanners, and then you've got the apprentices who can diagnose an electrical fault. So we have got that measure, and same within sales execs. I think that what I've seen is if it's of value to you, of whatever age you might happen to be, you'll find a way to be able to do it. That's what I've seen. And I think the great thing is within our business, we've got the youngsters now where we're getting heavily involved in this. That's being passed on to the older people in the network saying, actually, this is how you do it. So we've actually got some internal training going on how to work with technology. And everybody of all ages, because that's what we manage the age through our LMS, so we know who's engaging. We don't have any issues really now. We did when we started because it's like, that's never going to work. But it's been in for 2 years now and it's the mainstay and people get involved. And the feedback in terms of end of course feedback is that people like this way of learning because it's available to them when they want it. Not when we say it's going to be in 2 weeks on Wednesday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm sorry you've got to travel 230 miles to get here, but we'll see you then. So I think they actually appreciate it as well more, which is quite an interesting output of it.
Anybody else? Oh, yes, indeed. They're coming thick and fast. Go ahead.
Sorry, Brooke, so quick question. No mentioned this already, apologies, but size of the team and kind of cost for this.
Yeah.
That's something you can share.
So when we started, they were all internal people that we started with. They were actually either ex-trainers or ex-administration staff. So it started with one person, a young lad called Tom Blades, who used to be an apprentice, and then he was a trainer, etc., etc. The kit that we put in to facilitate the things that I showed you there, it cost me £54,000 a year for the kit hired, and that was over a 3-year deal. So the kit doesn't cost anything. That team now has gone from one, plus that kit of £54,000. It's costing me about £80,000 now because we've evolved the technology over that period, and there's now 6 people working in that team. So the total cost, including salary, is just under £300,000, which is nothing. And in terms of what that plays, I mean, it's producing stuff all the time. Interestingly enough, I've actually commercialised it as well now. So I sell the filming assets back to the marketing department to generate the money to cover the cost. So we go and do all the films for them now. So that was quite an interesting byproduct as well, because it's all wooden dollars now. I charge them internally, they give me the money. My budget looks good at the end of the year. But actually, we've not spent any cash.
It's lovely. Do you want to go ahead?
It's an observation now.
Charlie likes that as well, Sheena.
Yeah, I'm sure she does. My sister-in-law works with him.
In finance.
It's an observation rather than a question around your kind of ballsiness about it.
Yeah.
Right, this is what we're going to do and being able to do that.
I've been there for 23 years, so it wasn't like I've only been there for a couple of years with that topic. That maybe it would have never happened if I hadn't been there for such a long time.
Look, I quite like that. I think there's something in that about just saying, right, we're gonna try and give this a go and see what happens and make it work around you. And the result of that being that you're getting invited into conversations you may not.
Yeah.
otherwise have invited into.
And I think that probably answers quite a few questions, really. Because nobody's bothered about training, or hasn't been, certainly in the local organisation, you can have those ballsy conversations, say, we're going to go and do all that. And then when you actually get to the point where you go and launch it, you're kind of really worried about it, because you've done all the work and nobody's actually challenged you at any point. But then when you roll it out, it's allowed us to have those outputs, which have been very powerful for us as a business unit. Very powerful.
Yes.
And actually, our budgets are growing
hang
now
on.
year on year. They're giving us
still
more
going.
money, which is great.
You done? Yeah, right. Okay, over to you.
What would be your challenge for this year?
For this year, we're going to roll out the serious game this year. Yeah, so it's currently being built at the moment. So probably in June we'll roll the serious game out. And also, so there's that, and we've recently taken on a new learning management system, which is already integrating that virtual academy into it. But I want to start. I want to do more with that. The new learning management system will allow us to do so much more with reports and data, which essentially I come back in now to those meetings to start proving that people are important in terms of their ability to learn through this system, and how far can we take that.
Any more for any more? Oh, yes, there we go. If I go to the lady in the yellow, and I'll come back to you after that, okay? Go ahead.
So, I'm really impressed with what you've been able to create in the organisation. What does external training look like for your team now that you've got this great offer internally?
What does it look like for my team in terms of their training?
I'm thinking more around the executive level. Is there still the need within your business to look externally to develop some of the more senior leaders?
So I'll make sure I get it. So to actually recruit people externally to deliver training, or to deliver training to people face to face. So
So the face-to-face piece.
Yes, yeah. So
we
we
still have a place in your business?
yeah. Well, interestingly enough, yes, it does. As you would expect it to. We've got some senior business people that own businesses, multi-million-pound franchises, and we do regional seminars with some guest speakers that will talk to them about profit, etc., etc. So we work with a guy called Andrew McMillan, who is of John Lewis. He goes out and talks to the dealers about people, which is quite interesting because that's what we think. So he will say the people are the most important. But what we actually do is we film him, and then we use those assets again, so people that can't make the day can at least still immerse themselves in it, which is something we do now all the time. If we do anything, we film it and we make it available to people. So yes, there still is a need for that, but I think that's the technology is slowly closing that. Certainly for me, it won't be for everybody, but certainly for me it will.
Okay. Do you want to go ahead?
I was just wondering about the whole sort of change management, culture change aspect of moving from classroom training, albeit not very well attended, to virtual training. Were there any particular challenges that you faced around that? And also, when you first launched it, was it a case of we'll build it and they will come, or how did you get people to interact with it?
That's exactly what we did. We built it because we anticipated that they would come. I think we communicated a lot as we went through the process, just to say we recognise that you can't come to the one centre that now is in Coventry from the top of Scotland or the bottom of Cornwall or from Southern or Northern Ireland. And we just put our feelers out for it. And the great thing is that the people that use it do see the value of it themselves, both financially because they can work whilst they train, and because they're getting something out of it, i.e. we're teaching them how to better do their job. So we just built it because, again, there was no pressure on us. We were doing hardly any training attended. So we said, I'll tell you what, we'll put it on there and we'll see what happens. And it's just snowballed. We welcome now every person that starts in our network. You may remember I said a 40% turnover. Everybody that starts in our business on the day that they start can be welcomed now virtually by the chief executive of the company. So we filmed him welcoming any new start, whether it's a technician, sales exec or whatever it is, but it's facilitated by a trainer. So although there's a pre-recorded piece from the chief executive, the trainer then comes on and talks to you. So you've made a great decision, and you can ask that person questions. We used to be able to get to that person starting in 3 months when they came on a welcome to the brand course. Now we can do it on the day that they start. And we've actually got data that proves now that if we can get that person through the virtual academy quicker, which was the 14% uplift in qualification, we had an average day, they would stay with us in the business for 98 days as sales exec with no training, and they would go because they didn't have any training and probably very little support. When we delivered the virtual academy, the 14% of people, the majority of them were sales execs, are now staying in the business past 200 days, qualified to a silver or gold level because they can get access to training. Might not have answered your old question there, but there were a couple of things that were quite important.
Okay, go ahead.
Was the IT infrastructure already in place that you could deliver this?
So, no. So the hiring of the kit essentially is the cameras and the licensing, etc., etc. The only thing that I had to put in on top of that cost, so I've not been truthful to you, sorry, 54th, I did put a £20,000 internet connection in, which is literally straight into the room where this is broadcast out of, because that's the bottleneck. We didn't want to have all this great stuff, then hit the internet and then not be able to go out.
And what about the other inputs?
It's fine, just PCs. We tested it all. I had a field force that literally went out to every dealer and tested their internet speed. The Adobe Connect broadcast pod can go down to 500 kilobytes, and within a contract, they have to have over 5 megabytes in terms of their speed to have a contract with us. So we'd already tested that. It wasn't really an issue.
Yes, go ahead.
What do you do when actually somebody is not doing it? Kind of socials, and if somebody just doesn't do it?
Well, if they don't do it, they don't become qualified. And if they don't become qualified, then again, I'll speak to my friends in the franchise team. We're not interested in having unqualified people speaking to customers. So we will terminate their contract. Guess what? So, but we couldn't do that. We couldn't do that before because we only had one training site. So guess what the people were saying? Well, are you going to help us get to the site and cover the hotel costs?
Yeah.
No, we're not. So they get the buy then, not to get away with not being qualified. Through this mechanism now, they haven't got that excuse anymore.
But the motivation is also the pressure. If you're doing the training, is also if I don't do it, you're fired.
Well, not maybe that person won't get fired. What I mean is we'll actually terminate the dealer contract. So so it's quite a powerful thing. We don't want anybody going into any of our sites and not having a trained person selling them a vehicle. We have to get better at these things, and unfortunately we have to bring out the heavy hitting element of saying this is serious now. But we got to that point by having a training offer that they can't get away from. We have a standards program which is we've been running for 5 years, and essentially we take money from the dealer network for each contract, and we were taking the money and we were offering them training. and they weren't coming on the training, so they weren't getting their money back. And every time we marked the standards, I must have had 400 phone calls from the network saying, I was going to come, sorry, I couldn't, all of the excuses that you could ever imagine. When we delivered the virtual academy system, and this is not one word of a lie, we marked the standards and I probably had 5 to 6 telephone calls because they recognised they weren't going to win a conversation with me about not being able to get training. So it just takes all of those things away now. Hopefully we won't have to be so harsh with them in the future.
I'll go to the lady on the left and then I'll come back to you in a moment, okay?
Question for Rafe. You mentioned in your presentation that there's a gap between learning and development reporting from the L D department and what the business is expecting. How do you see that bridge being sort of that gap being bridged? Because I don't quite see how learning and development with business hacks on without certain set of skill sets or having a business representative in an L D as a financial head can report that data to you.
Sure.
Practically to the business.
Yeah, I think part of it is partnering with the business to understand actually what are the questions they're answering. So I think a part of it is getting that bridge and getting that communication, because the whole thing about, well, we're presenting up this set of stats and the business saying, well, that's not what we want to know. They say, well, tell us what you want to know then. I think part of it is also picking up some of those, that business nous, for want of a better term. I've been one of them, and I know a lot of L&D people who love L&D for L&D, and you'll train people all day and you'll get feedback on your training, but it's being able to put on that business hat and say, okay, yeah, we're doing that, but why are we doing it? What does it mean to the business? And digging down to that layer. So I think it is partly being able to put on a business mentality and being a bit more business mindful rather than sitting in our learning development silo and just looking at, are people happy and satisfied with the training we're rolling out, to look at the bigger picture.
Do you think there's a place to maybe having a business person transitioning into an L&D role to partly bridge that gap?
Yeah, I mean, I came into L&D through a customer service and customer service management background myself, and I've certainly found it very valuable having been in that position, so I get that slightly external perspective, and that's not to cast any aspersions on people who've come up purely through L&D, but I think it's very valuable for those guys to either spend some time in the business or partner with someone in the business to be able to just look at things from that different perspective, or to find someone they can partner with. Say, okay, well, tell me, what is it you're looking for from us? And it's us going out and asking those questions, and it's very easy to presume what they want. And as I said there, we made that exact presumption. We presumed the business was going to come to us and say, tell us cash money, what's the benefit? And we presumed that, and that wasn't the case. So we've been as guilty of that as anyone else, I think.
Lady in the cream cardigan.
So we actually assess through the classroom, actually through Virtual Academy, because we build in every 5 minutes an interaction, which is part of the assessment, which is then linked to an individual via Adobe Connect. And at the end of that session, whether you come on an attended or a virtual course, we actually put you through a test. It's a post-assessment. We actually have a pre-assessment as well, because if you've got the knowledge, you can pre-assess yourself as not needed training. So we do have a pre and a post-assessment strategy for that. So that also proves it. If you've listened to what you were being told on the VA session, you'll know what the answers are, because they're multiple choice questions out of a very large bank. So it's not like people are writing them all down to get them all right, which of course you can do with that volume of training. You can know the questions and start selling them on eBay. No answers, sorry.
Anybody? Yes, go ahead.
Question for Rafe. You mentioned you need lots of data, big data. Have you got examples of kind of interesting juxtapositions of data sets, like you've got sort of business information, you have the information, and then analyze that?
Yeah. I don't think it's necessarily the case you need lots of data. I think once you start down this route and you start digging into it, you start generating more and more, and you find more things to look for. I think there's the whole big data question. I think as systems start to converge and we start looking at the bigger talent space rather than just L&D, we do start seeing overlaps. So one of the things we're going to be looking at this year, as I mentioned there, is if we're seeing a particular benefit being reported back through L&D feedback. So it's saying, oh yes, we're seeing, we think this is going to increase employee engagement, that we're then able to go and look at our employee engagement data and tie that back and say, okay, well, what group said that? It was the customer service group. So what's the employee engagement score look like this year for the customer services group versus the other last year, or versus the rest of the team, and has that gone up or down in response to what they've said? So I think there's lots of connections you can make, but I think the important thing is to get started with it somewhere. So if you haven't got those massive integrated systems and you're starting, okay, well, I haven't got much to start off with, just start measuring. And when I was at Gartner, I built my own feedback system just based on HTML and Perl to start collating stuff so we can move away from paper-based to online. And that started building up the historical data that we could then compare, and then we could say, okay, what else is there we can start hooking in to feed extra little bits of data in. So yeah, I don't think it's a case that you need it, but if you've got it, you can you certainly start seeing the correlations and making little connections.
Okay, I'll come back to you. The lady behind you was up first. Off you go.
Well, you make the distinguish between measuring behavior and measuring business impact.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how it works when you say establish expectations beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
What does success look like?
Mm-hmm.
Can you get a real agreement on whether it is a behavior goal or a business goal?
Mm-hmm.
Or are they both there, or is there in between? Or how does it look like?
Yeah, I think it can well be both. So when you're sitting down with the stakeholders and saying, okay, well, what do you want out of this training? Quite often they'll come back with a behavioural thing. I want people to make this change. And then it's a case of drilling down and say, okay, so what's that? Why do you want to make that change? What is that going to mean? Well, that's going to mean they're going to sell more. Okay, how much more do you anticipate they're going to sell? What are we targeting there? So it's helping the business to make those connections. Pardon me. In the same way as making sure that sometimes it's the other way around. They're saying, okay, well, what do you expect to get out of this training? I expect customer satisfaction to go up. How do you see that happening? What's the change? So sometimes it's a step backwards. So you definitely need to connect those two bits up so you can get the whole picture.
And for all our learning and development, that's all right. Are they going to process like, no, that's too hard measurement, or that's not only by training, and how do you know, or how do you stick to this measurement?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, working in partnership with the business, we need to make sure that what they're asking is realistic. If they say, what do you expect? I'm expecting to double our sales because of this training, and we know from our experience, okay, that's not really a realistic expectation, that we should challenge back on that and say, okay, can we agree something a bit more realistic? In terms of tying down how much is due to the training, how much is due to other things. So you might have a target of 10%, and you look at the end of the year, it's 20% sales have gone up. Again, I think it's just looking and say, okay, if I claim that's just due to my training, can I prove that? What can I do to demonstrate that, or to isolate how much is in the training? You can do that partially through questioning. So, for example, in our question set, we actually ask the learner and the manager, how much of an improvement do you think is going to happen, or have you seen, and how much of that would you attribute to the training you went on? So it can also be quite useful if you've got a control group. So if you've got one group of sales in a particular period, salespeople that have been through a training, and another that haven't, and you can see, well, that group went up by 15%, that group went up by 5%. There's a good argument there for saying, okay, 10% is due to the training. Yeah, looking at other factors going on as well.
Okay, last question then from the gentleman in the front here. Over to you.
Sometimes things go 360, so it's all by virtual learning now. So moving away from the classroom, tutor-led training, the trainer can engage different types of learners. So moving away from that and just people purely looking at the screen,
Yeah.
how do you truly know that is a more effective way to learn?
I just know that people are learning now, whereas before they weren't. So from my perspective, by getting people through the virtual door and getting me in front of people in the business, I can now maybe start to think about other ways of training. So we could imagine in the future that the virtual academy is the bit that got the foot in the door, and when the door's open and we start thinking about the people, we might even move away from virtual training into the other area. But at the moment, the facts are there, the KPIs are there to show that it is having a business impact pre and post that delivery method for the business. But like, there are other aspirations that we need to move into. But we have to get there first. If I'm just trying to explain, we've started something that's allowed us to build upon something now where everybody's thinking, yeah, we better speak to training.
I think there is a definite place for it. I come from an industry where the shipping industry, a lot of training has to be tutor-led, practical.
Yeah.
It's approved by the ACA and things like that. So
Yeah.
you can't get away from that. But I think a blended learning approach where you've got some virtual learning to support it, but not necessarily replacing it.
Yeah. We've been training technicians now for probably the last 8 months on the new 3-cylinder engines that we produce, and it's literally how to strip the engine down and how to change the cam belt. You know, it's quite in-depth stuff. And literally we filmed with a technical trainer the strip down of that whole engine and the voiceover. I mean, it's so intricate, this film, you wouldn't believe it. Now, if we do an attended course on that, we can get 9 people sat around it. I've got 3 technical trainers. If I do a virtual course, I could do 60 people in one go. Now, I know for a fact, because I've sat and spoken to the people that come on the technical training, for that level of engineering, for want of a better word, they prefer the virtual delivery method. So I've actually gone and spoke to these people, not just because they save their cost and make their money, they're actually going, I can see more. And we make that film available to them. Some of the dealers now have invested in 60-inch plasmas in the workshop. So rather than reading the manual that comes, say, like, undo, torque bolt, and make sure you have a spanner, they actually have got a film watching how to change the cam belt. And they're playing it and pausing it and going back. So and I've got the Google Analytics to prove at what minute they stopped at and what they're going back over. So we use that information to make sure that that film is absolutely right. So we do use it in terms of engineering. And there are people saying, actually, this is better. Because they can see it for themselves, not kind of trying to move around people.
Super. One more. Off you go.
Yeah. What about the vehicle launches? I mean, does it replace that? Does it?
We've got we increased a little bit of money in terms of the rental, and we bought something called a bond unit, which is a 4G broadcast box, which is probably about twice the size of this iPhone. And we put that box in the C4 Cactus when we launched it. It was an attended training course, but we put it in the car, and we had a commercial trainer and a driver out in the vehicle, and we took it to the ProDrive test facility in Warwick. And it was being broadcast live from the car straight to the training facility where people were watching the driving dynamics of the vehicle, and they were actually able to ask over the telephone, then or whichever way we did it live, to do different things in the car. So we could imagine in the future that yes, it could do exactly that. And this Sky's been using this thing now for about the last 6 months. They use it because it's a high definition broadcast box, and they use it now at Premiership football games. It costs £3,000. So they don't turn up anymore in their big Sky vans with the big Sky dish on it. They just use these little boxes with 4G connectors on them.
When they're asked by a customer, how does it feel, that car?
Listen, I'm sure there's technology that we could put in the car to say this is how it feels. We just haven't found it yet.
I think they were talking about haptic feedback this morning, weren't they, in the technology stream? So
I'm sure if you were sat in
something
every one now, between now, you'd be going, actually, I think that could work with Phil's stuff. I better go and tell him.
Super. Well, look, thank you very much for a great discussion session. That has been so interesting. And also a huge thanks to our speakers, Philip Price and Rafe Ball. Thank you very much.